excited to share a little bit more about Assemble Insight with you today, and also, as Danielle mentioned, the BIM 360 integration. So I wanted to start by taking a kind of look back at the industry, where we're at today, why a tool like Assemble is necessary, and kind of lead that into what the product does, how we integrate with BIM 360 and the other products that you guys have heard about throughout the webinar series. So a little bit more about myself. I grew up in Rutland, Vermont, so I'm a small town kid. I attended the University of Vermont and graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Engineering with a focus in structures. Shortly after college, I decided to join a startup I didn't know very much about, Assemble Systems. And little did I know that it was going to send me on quite the journey over the next few years, but really got fully immersed in BIM. I had the opportunity to work with all of our largest accounts, being pretty early in the company, and really took a big hand in the international expansion of Assemble as well. So I feel like through my experiences with Assemble, I've got a pretty wide-ranging view of the construction industry, from America all the way out through Europe and Asia as well. I base it at Boston, and I really like sustainability. So that's not going to be too much of a conversation today, but definitely something that might come up as we go. So as we get into Assemble, like I said, I want to take a step back and look at construction in general. And I think this is pretty clear to pretty much everyone that construction is by far the most collaborative industry, yet the most fragmented in the world. We have all these different products, we have all these different teams, tools, and unless you're in a design build situation, there's not even that much collaboration between different shareholders and stakeholders in a project. That leads to a very, very slow growth in productivity. This is from the McKinsey Global Report of Reinventing Construction, a Route to Higher Productivity. Over the past 2 decades, construction productivity has only grown 1% a year. And we look at other industries and other different types of companies throughout the country and the world. We see productivity being driven by technology. We see cloud computing. We see all sorts of other growth throughout those sectors. But construction seems to be pretty flat compared to everybody else. And that leads to margins being historically low, the lowest except of any industry except for retail. And I think that really aligns with productivity. If productivity doesn't increase, as inflation goes forward and increases, you're always going to see margins get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go. And we look at now a digitization index, once again produced by McKinsey Global, but we look at where construction sits in terms of digitization compared to other industries. And other than agriculture and hunting, and like I said, I'm a small town boy, so I know a lot about both of those things. Construction is at the bottom of the graph here, and to be compared to agriculture and hunting when it comes to digitization, I think is not the best place to be. So the question is, what challenges do these cause, and how do we fix them? So we look at internal and external challenges across the entire industry. We look at internal issues, shortfalls in accountability, talent management. It's hard to find good workers. We see a decrease in the amount of skilled trades and things of that nature. I find companies all the time trying to reinvent the wheel when technology could always drive forward those workflows, but they run into struggles because they fail to adopt and adapt to these new technologies. And that leads to a problem with utilization of resources. And those resources are either completely underutilized, or you have a product that works great, but you're afraid to use it, or it's overutilization in terms of you're doing things extremely manually. So you're using up all your man hours, your time spent on things that could be much more streamlined if digitized and worked in a 3D manner. That's not all of the issues, though, because then we look at external issues: fragmented value chains, extensive subcontracting, complex portfolios, competition, and coping with complexity. As jobs get more and more complex going forward, we look at sustainable building. Once again, I said I'm a big sustainability guy. I think that sustainable building actually deals with, or is the next step of dealing with a lot of these things. We look at coping with complexity. Not saying that sustainable buildings are more complex, but they're different. They're new. They take a different set of skills that not everybody is equipped with today. So how do we bridge that gap with not just sustainable buildings, but also with more complex projects and jobs as time goes on. Then we look at a little bit more granularly here. We look at estimating departments. Assemble's very heavily used in pre-construction. So we look at those challenges, all things that anybody in pre-construction is completely familiar with: tight deadlines, limited resources and manpower, lack of expertise in 3D models and BIM. The biggest of all, I think, is the lack of a constructible model. I think this is a huge point of kind of the crux of the issue, we'll call it, with the gap between design and construction. I think that is the real crux of every single thing that we see throughout these challenges in VDC and in the estimating departments here. But the others, siloed out, design iterations, expectations, all challenges that a normal conventional BIM department doing things in 2D are going to deal with. I'm not going to run through how everything Assemble can do to help here, just because I will get into it as we go. But you see a couple of the points: takeoff times reduced, spending more time on what actually matters to your teams, ability to kind of bridge that gap between design and construction. But like I said, we'll get into more of these points as we get into the product more deeply. Lastly, here we look at VDC department challenges. So BIM resources, I think one thing that's probably not even listed on here is the lack of VDC in a lot of organizations. I see lots of companies that if they want to use BIM and they're early on in their process of using building information models, they don't even have a VDC department. So they're left with all of the same issues in estimating, but now they're also adopting challenges for the VDC department. And if you do have a VDC department, there's still going to be challenges of limited resources. The need to actually share this information, these things go hand in hand. We look at estimating department challenges with lack of BIM experience. Now that feeds to the challenge of the VDC having to share and provide everything for the estimating teams, because no one is on the same page. You see, once again, persisting here is the lack of a constructible model. It's the biggest issue across the entire industry, in my opinion. And you see this, as we go through the list of points, often tasks with extracting quantities for estimating, things that are just outside of their job description. So how we help? We extending the model to key stakeholders. We're cloud-based. There's all sorts of great things that we'll get into as we go. But the question now is, I guess, why Assemble? So instant access to BIM data for pre-construction and construction workflows. I start pretty simple with that point. Is really a lot of these things that I mentioned in terms of challenges are fed by the fact that BIM right now is centric to design. The design teams and architecture firms have heavy-duty computers. They have extensive training and technical acumen, and they're working in these tools and using them to their full extent on a day-to-day basis. You take that design process and plop it into a construction world, the biggest issue right off the bat is that nobody understands those BIM, those design tools. They're not construction tools. They're great at what they do, but they're not for construction firms. So getting this information into the hands of people is first and foremost, in my opinion, one of the most important things that you can do to enable a team to begin leveraging these sorts of technologies. We look at the other aspects that Assemble can really touch on here, and all of these things don't extend the entire project lifecycle, but that really is where we're headed here, as a tool that allows you to leverage BIM not only in pre-construction, but also throughout procurement, throughout the construction phase, and even assisting with operations and handover. But the big points being change analysis. I had somebody yesterday tell me that it took them just as long to quantify the second iteration of design as it does their first. And that's crazy to me. You spend all this time understanding what compiles the budget in the first iteration, and then somebody plops a different design update on top of you, and it's like, all right, I have to start completely over. With Assemble, you don't. You can just compare and contrast models quite easily and very quickly understand exactly what has changed. We'll get into this more, but condition models. When you look at the definition of that word conditioned, or to condition a model, The conventional definition of that word is to make ready for use. And that conditioning is really what allows us to bridge the gap between design and construction. But like I said, we'll get into that as we go as well. Model quantification, automatically generating quantities right out of the box. Well, like I said, these are all things that we'll dive into in more depth. But iterative pre-con estimating, back to change analysis, sequencing, so seeing how your job actually plays out as you move forward against the schedule. One of the big things that we talked about today is the BIM 360 integration. We'll make sure to touch on that and how that can feed back into all these other products and workflows that you guys are executing with these other tools. And we look at the access of models and views and how we can leverage to that stuff to win at an interview, to show an owner that we have a complex understanding of this job and where we are the best option for you to execute it. So this is my favorite of all the slides, at least from the message that I'm trying to construe. And I haven't really gotten into it in too much detail yet, but this idea of bridging the gap between design and construction is important. We look at the design model on the left-hand side here. Beautiful model, great looking, pretty crisp, but at the end of the day, that model provides little to nothing to a construction team, especially a construction team with no pre-existing knowledge of BIM or modeling practices. And then you look at the right-hand side, the construction model, colorized, isolated, broken down by the important and relevant parameters. And the question now is, how do we get there? And Assemble and this idea of model conditioning is really what allows us to bridge that gap. You look at design as one language, construction is a completely separate language, and we need that translator. We need that product that allows to take one language, add whatever you need, translate it into your language, which is where we end up at the construction model and how Assemble is really driving this forward. So we do this through the ability to add parameters and properties through directly into the model for work breakdown or location structures. For work in place, we can apply statuses, we can apply cost codes, we can import the schedule. All these construction things that, when we think about it, really should live in the design model in the first place, but that stakeholder in design isn't as concerned with construction and how that plays out. So connecting your team and empowering your team with easy and functional BIM workflows. That is probably the one biggest tagline we can take away from today is easy and functional BIM workflows. Revit is great for what it does, but once again, it's not tied to anything construction focused. It requires a different set of skills than a contractor's employee would generally hold, unless you are coming from that industry as a VDC coordinator. And that, when you think about that role of VDC, that really is the same sort of idea as Assemble, where we're looking to bridge that gap between the design world and the construction world. But we now look at a little bit more of a technical slide. We get into the workflows and the processes that Assemble is going to execute. We look at the 3D design authoring tools. So the idea here is to take a Revit model, to take an IFC, to take a Navisworks federated file, to take a model from Tekla, and automatically and directly import them from their authoring tool into the cloud where they're hosted in Assemble. Assemble, like I said, is completely cloud-based. From there, anybody can access this from a web browser. And through this idea of data conditioning leads to three main kind of avenues of workflow. We look at quantification and change management, work in place tracking and field reporting, data management, and we also look at our integration partners, which we'll discuss in a moment. But for quantification, the biggest thing is validating that a model is correct. Garbage in, garbage out is something that I hear and everyone probably knows very much about. We look at model comparisons as well, where we compare and contrast models. We push to Excel, whether it be as for a report or whether it be for a pre-existing Excel spreadsheet. And then we look at the application of cost codes, the assignment of information to make this process a lot more streamlined, to provide instantaneous quantities. Then the nice thing is, if you've used that model in pre-construction and you've used the model to quantify your building, We look at the secondary workflow, work in place tracking. If you're tracking the status of objects and their quantities as they get installed on site, and you're doing that on the same exact system that you've used for quantification, there was a one-to-one tie between what has been completed and what was budgeted. So you can actually use the same system to collect and report those progress metrics of what's actually happening on site. And that can allow you to look at percentage complete, allow you to look at budget utilization. This can all be done from an iOS app, so you're able to pull these models up, whether with or without internet on site, and look at those 3D views and in real time update all of those parameters and pieces of information that the field team might need to understand. We also make a special call out to this kind of process of collecting and reporting field data in a time that is unprecedented, where job sites are much more regulated for interactivity between people. We look at the pandemic forcing offices to close and people to work from home. There's no doubt in my mind that the way the pandemic has affected not just the industry, but the world is going to change things for good. It's not just a thing here where once this is all done, we'll forget about it. This is going to affect the world as we know it for the indefinite future, in my opinion. So we look at the ability to maintain our productivity levels by sharing information, by collecting and reporting and not having to meet with everybody on a regular basis on site, being able to have separate people input separate data into the same system, but they don't have to interact with 5 different people to get their paper-based daily report to whoever needs to update the ERP system with the daily progress. And finally, we look at data management, a much more complex and higher level conversation, but the ability to group, sort, and filter any data that exists in that Revit model. The ability to populate and push data back into Revit. We look at data templates and assemble properties, which I talked about in terms of conditioning. And then we look at our first integration we'll talk about, which is the Power BI integration. So being able to push these dashboards or this data into dashboards and allow for visualization in a completely different way. I mentioned Excel integration, and then you see that we also have BIM 360 and the Autodesk Construction Cloud. So for BIM 360, we can push issues and look at documents, and we'll be able to do the same thing with ACC as Autodesk begins to build out that platform and really unify all of the products that we currently have under our portfolio. So just really dissecting these pieces and subjects a little bit more granularly as we go through the rest of these slides. We look at the instant access to this BIM and project data. I think I've probably beat a dead horse with this, but team-wide access to models, quantities, and relevant project data, the real-time visualization and quantification of those changes, the ability to federate these different systems together. We look at a common process, and construction probably isn't just going to have a Revit model or a set of Revit models. You're going to have CAD models from your subs. You're going to have Civil 3D models from your infrastructure team and your site staff. You're going to have Revit models for your vertical structures and your MEP systems. So being able to access all of these things at once isn't just important for one team. It's a matter of to really access all of these things, you need to know 3 different tools and have 3 different pieces of software and 3 different training classes, rather than being able to handle all of the different data types in one similar way in the cloud. We look at model-based quantities for takeoff and estimating. I will get into some live demo here after we wrap up this slide deck, but you see over on the right-hand image, all of the quantities for those concrete elements being totaled up to aggregate values. And this isn't the way that Revit outputs data. Revit outputs things as categories, families, and types. So when we look at those naming conventions, they generally aren't related back to the packages for estimating or the bidding objects for a bid package that you're putting together. So being able to group, sort, and filter these things to get to relevant parts of the model and relevant structures of data is really one of the biggest things that we can provide on the quantitative side of things. Other than that, quantities are extracted right out of the box as we import things into Assemble. So that's just going to be first and foremost, no matter what you're doing, is the quantity will always be tied back to the object that is shown in that line item. From here, you look at, there's actually some colorization applied to this image on the right. We look at the ability to colorize by levels, by codes, by schedules. You could even bring in your coding structure and apply your codes, even if they're completely custom and specific to your organization. And lastly, but not least, on the model-based takeoff, we look at the ability to supercharge a Revit schedule. So I think that's a corny term, supercharge, and I probably wrote it myself. So I guess I'm the corny one here. But the idea is that when you get quantities out of a Revit model, you are given a schedule, whether it be in Revit or in Excel. And then that's it. You have a static schedule of all the quantities that exist. The idea being, Assemble is really taking that Revit schedule and using it as a jumping off point. So Revit's final output is actually Assemble's starting point to begin working and begin quantifying and building out that budget and estimates. Automated change analysis. This is the thing that's kind of the bang for your buck, the best bang for your buck with Assemble here, where once a design update occurs, all you're forced to do is update and upload that new design iteration into Assemble. You'll see that there's actually just an option to click and show changes. And from there, Assemble does all the hard work and heavy lifting for you, allowing you to see what was changed, what was added, removed, type changed, quantity changed, type or quantity changed. I look at things that are added and removed, probably pretty easily able to be seen throughout an overlay of 2D documents or through like just notes throughout a spec sheet. But how do you understand when a type of an object has changed or a quantity has changed? Things that are not blatantly obvious when you go and understand that overlay or look at the breakdown of information. So this comparative analysis can take what is a multi-hour process, multi-day process, and make it instantaneous. And like I said, if you've validated that model on the front end of things and you've done the work to update and to condition your model to your standard, even if the first iteration of design or the first iteration of quantification takes as long as it would in 2D, this automated change analysis is going to allow you to understand and leverage that work you've done on the front end for an extremely expedited process going forward. Then we take a different look at some of these things, and we look at work in place tracking on site. So I touched on it a little bit, but from Assemble on the web, we can take those views that we save, we can take those data sets that we work with, and we can pull them up on our iPad or our iPhone, and we can turn it offline so we don't even need to have connectivity or Wi-Fi. From there, you're still able to select on objects, to see the project inventory, to see all those same groupings and structures that you built out during the pre-construction phase. And from there, you're able to actually update and add information from the field that syncs directly back into the cloud and updates everybody with whatever reporting they need to get out of the model for progress, for actual starts and finish dates, for all sorts of different field data that you might need to collect. Let me get into one of the main highlights of our conversation today, the linking with BIM 360 docs. So BIM 360 and Assemble are slowly but surely converging on one another as time goes on. The functionality in Assemble greatly complements the things that BIM 360 is able to do, and BIM 360 greatly complements Assemble. So we look at Assemble's weaknesses, particularly being in 2D workflows, and BIM 360 being the document management system for all of our BIM 360 modules. Once a document is hosted in BIM 360, we can then connect and tie that document directly to a model object. So whether it be a spec sheet, a 2D document that's a schedule or something, you can tie those documents directly to a model object in Assemble and have that persistence of that 2D and 3D for whether it be detailed notes or specifications that might not exist in that Revit system. We also look at issue tracking, so directly back into the design workflow, and I've seen a whole bunch of unique workflows come out of this, but the ability to directly input issues back into BIM 360. So that issue module in BIM 360 is always going to be the system of record and record keeping for these issues. So Assemble is allowing you to create and push issues directly into that BIM 360 module. So if there's ever a design issue, if there is a construction issue, if there's something that you need to alert the greater team, you can create an issue in Assemble, and that directly pushes back into BIM 360. So Power BI is another big piece here, but actually before we go into Power BI, quickly touching on some future states of BIM 360. But the biggest thing for our customers now is how do we continue to persist data from one place to another? We're now doing a push to get information into BIM 360. Why doesn't that happen automatically as we go to Assemble? And that is something that we're definitely working on today. So as time goes forward, we'll only see more and more connectivity, more and more integration, and more convergence of these tools upon one another to really start providing an end-to-end solution where Assemble manages this BIM data, and BIM 360 can perform some of the more specific tasks of RFIs, daily submittals, things of that nature. And lastly, and most importantly in my mind, because I'm a nerd for Power BI, but taking all of these quantities, taking all of these statuses, taking all of the information that we aggregate, that we populate, that we condition throughout all of these workflows, and allow for an analytic visualization of these things. Obviously, a lot of people want to see this stuff, how it relates back to a model, how it relates back to the data set, but there's also a whole slew of people, whether it be project executives, owners, high-level project stakeholders, that they just want the 10,000-foot view of what's going on. And in my opinion, there's nothing better than providing a dashboard or a report in a tool like Power BI, which is a visualization tool from Microsoft that allows you to, in real time, update these graphics for percentage complete. As you see here, we have a trend of quantity and cost over design iterations and a breakout of the different quantities and how they make up the greater system. This can also be really informative for why is our cost so high? Because because we're using a special wall system, and walls make up 50% of our quantity. Either way, these advanced analytics, I think, are overwhelming for some folks, but once you take that step in understanding how this data works and how you can look at it in a new way, I think there's a huge potential here for really anything that you need to see. I have worked with customers to do advanced tracking of progress. I then see people taking that progress and tying it directly back to their timesheets out of the tools like Rumbic, tracking man hours, and then tying that back to the budgeted man hours, the budget out of the ERP system, so they can track utilization, they can track trends, they can track so many advanced things as they go throughout their process. And I think there is this image on the left is really what I'm saying in a nutshell here, that we have all of this data. Assemble is going to aggregate all of this data for you. It's even might let you sort it and arrange it the way that you want, but we don't allow you to present that visually. And we look at how these things go throughout their phases, the data sorted, arranged, and presented visually. What would your preferred method be here? Probably presented visually. So we look at these data points and these things and how we can really drive forward data-driven workflows. So that is everything I got here for this slide deck. Let me make a quick change over to the Assemble interface here. So as I reload the 3D viewer, we hop into Assemble. It's very similar to all the images that you saw throughout my slide deck. Over on the left-hand side, we see this inventory. We see all of the objects as they were extracted out of Revit. If we dig into something like floors, you see that we have the categories and families already being broken down, but we also have every object with its own individual line item. You also see that line item totals up to that aggregate value for the family and type, but also the entire category. And this can be done for any and all of the different objects and systems that we see throughout the inventory. One of the big things is being able to visualize your selection, understand exactly what you are looking at. So I make a selection in my inventory. You notice that same selection is highlighted over on my 3D viewer. This connectivity persists in the 3D back to the 2D, where I can select an object in my viewer and be directly pulled to what that object is. I can even do this from 2D to 3D. So if you have Revit sheets that exist in your Revit project, I can actually come in and extract those Revit sheets. And then in the same way that I've selected an object in my viewer and seen it selected in my inventory, if I go to all the sheets and see what's selected, not only am I going to be pulled to the correct sheet, you'll actually see the highlighted object as it exists on that sheet. And I can actually make selections out of these sheets and see those things highlighted back throughout the Assemble viewer. So you see that from making a selection in the sheet, I've now highlighted quite a bit of that 3D model, which makes sense as I drag and sweep selected. So as we look here at the property sets and all the other things that we're providing, I just need to get this go-to reading bar out of my way. So as I select an object throughout this model, whether it be a door, a window, just about anything that I want to work with, not only are we going to get its quantity on the front end, its square footage in this case, but if I scroll over on the back end of things, you'll notice that we're also providing all these other parameters and values, dimensions, and things that exist throughout the model. But on top of all of that, we're extracting every single piece of information that exists within that model. So all of that's going to be housed in what we call our model properties on the bottom right-hand side of this window. So as I scroll down throughout this property set, if I go into my instance properties here, I want to just select an object here, make sure we're just working with a single thing. Here, we want to get rid of this. Apologies, there's this go-to reading bar that's very much in the way of Assemble here. Let's put it down here. So I select that object. I want to make sure there's just one thing selected here. So I come in. I can look at that object and look at all of its parameters as you saw over on the right-hand side. So as I scroll down through those parameters, you'll see for this wall, we have its level, we have its dimensions, we have materials if we dig for it, we have any of the parameters that might exist on top of the Revit model. You see a lot of that stuff is locked up. We don't want you to be able to change built out in specific naming conventions, but we want to allow you to be able to update and add information that exists in the model as well. So if you want to push this data back into Revit, you can, but we're not going to allow you to change those core elements of how the model is built out. On top of that, we look at the Assemble properties and the things that these can provide for our users. And I talked to these in a decent amount of depth, but you see here now the ability for me to come in and apply a parameter, to apply a piece of information. Maybe we want to look at a quantification workflow or something. We can start to add information to that. You also notice that as I scroll down, we have our estimating group that has places to put in coding structures, assumptions, value engineering options, along with calculations for things that don't exist out of the box. So maybe it's a weight, maybe it's formwork areas for concrete, just values and dimensions, things that you can't get out of a model. But we also look at installation statuses and those actual starts and end dates and man hours, things that you can collect from the site. So these parameters, as I said, are completely open-ended and customizable, but really allow you to get to that level of detail you need for your model to be useful. So as I start to get into things here. The last thing I'll point out before we run through a quick workflow to begin wrapping up our webinar today is a look at the different models and systems that we have in our product here. So I noticed I was just working with the architectural system out of the box, but you see we also have mechanical, plumbing, and structure. So looking at this federation of models, maybe we want to look at the structural model on top of the architectural model. I might just take a second to load here, but we're able to take multiple systems and without much effort, pull them together within the same interface. And you would hardly even notice that the structural model was added in, but you see now we have the piles at the bottom. And if we look, we probably have quite a bit more quantity for columns, framing, things of that nature. So the question now is, what if we wanted to start a workflow? Quantification is first in the process, so let's start with something quantity centric. And as an estimator, let's put my estimator hat on here. I always think about where to start and what do I do just to get off the start line. And it's really challenging if you don't understand BIM and the naming conventions that come out of Revit. Trying to understand and decompose what is in your Revit model is really a really challenging process. And out of the box, these categories, families, and types are not really connected or not really associated at all with the parameters I need as an estimator to really take off my quantities. And I need things by materials. I need things by cost code. I don't care if something's a structural column. That column could be one of 10 different like materials or types or codes. But if you dig into the parameters, you'll actually notice that we have those things and those pieces of data actually living in the background. And this is where things get really useful, is the ability to take these parameters and use them as methods of grouping, sorting, and filtering. So if I come into my data set here, maybe I want to see it based on that structural material. You see at the top, if I come in and I organize by that structure, nothing's being hidden, nothing's being removed. The only things we're seeing here is the data in a different way. I see now that my breakdown is done by my materials, helping me understand where my quantities live, much more so than the categories out of the box do for us as well. So I look now at all the quantities and all the information, but now I probably want to start aggregating these things together. I look at my steel. Maybe I want to take off that steel. Maybe I want to take off that concrete, whatever it might be. I can go through and select all of those things. And you can see I can come in and assign those to a bid package of steel. I can come in and do the same for concrete. And if you look at my viewer, actually, before we go to concrete, you can see all the steel framing and selected for those columns and those beams and joists and whatnot. We can once again take that same look at concrete. I can come in and select the different concrete elements that I need to include. I can add those to a package of concrete. And maybe I broke these things down in a different way, but you're able to break these concrete elements out into their individual packages. And it seems like a very simple workflow, a simple process. But I'd like to take a very quick look at something a little bit more granular, which is this group that is not assigned. And you'll see a lot of stuff populating through this not assigned grouping here, as not everything's going to have a structural material, but there are always certain things that I want to make sure that we're looking at, because there's always going to be things that are missing the relevant piece of information they need. And so being able to include some of these parameters and these values with one another and allowing to see the weights and whatnot. Maybe you need to include something that's not assigned with one of those packages. Maybe they didn't assign the material to half of your steel elements and you're going to miss quantities if you don't pick it up. There's however many reasons you might need to understand and update those things. But that's the idea of conditioning right there, is something missing the value that you need, and being able to take control over what you add and put back into that system. So lastly here, before we begin to, like I said, wrap up and take some questions, I want to look at using this stuff a little bit more functionally. We went by structure and material out of the box, but once again, now we probably don't want to deal with all of these other disciplines. Maybe we just care about that steel, or just care about that concrete. I can come down. Maybe I just want to isolate my steel. And take a second to update here. But if I go back to shaded, you'll see that we've isolated now to just our steel sections. And say I want to collapse down the viewer. Maybe I want to see this by those packages. Maybe I want a total aggregate of quantity. Maybe I want to organize by that bid package. At which point we can take all these things and align them with the correct dimension that we're looking for. Maybe we want, I assume for steel, we either want piece count or we're going to want weight. But either way, you can come in and populate out those quantities all day long. And you see here that this is a great example of things as they might not be aligned in the way that you want. Let's just actually get a piece count here. I don't see weight, so we'll just get a count of those steel elements. But what you haven't noticed here, or I haven't mentioned yet, is how I've structured this package or this grouping of bid package. If I come in to this package, I have complete control over how I structure this. So maybe instead of the very top being bid package, maybe I want it to be level, or maybe I want level to be secondary to how I organize my information. I can take that level, I can work that into my structure. And once again, nothing really changes the two drastically, other than getting a total piece count now for steel. We have our steel broken down by the individual levels. So you see that level 5 has a lot of steel. And then instead of seeing it by the categories and out of Revit, we're now seeing it by the shape of that steel. And then all the section sizes as well. So I've taken now a Revit model that had no pertinence to my workflow in estimating. And I'm able to now break it down any way that I want. I'm allowed to get any dimension I need. I'm allowed to come in and start colorizing based on those parameters. Maybe I want to visualize by all of my W sections or all my different families or shapes of steel sections. By using that parameter, I'm able to colorize the model based on that value and get a really intuitive and easy to work with data set. This is all great. Maybe I want to save it out for later. Maybe I want to create one of those data sets that the team on site can pull into an iPad and begin working with the beginning idea of that data. The idea here is I'm not going to run through field workflows because I don't need to. The only thing that you won't have seen that's required in the field workflow is the iPad. And that's the same concept as we have here, where we have the ability to add information as we need it. We have the ability to save it out as an intelligent view. And then if you want to colorize this based on your statuses, you use that parameter of status. You want to organize this by what's installed and what's not, you use that same parameter. We can then take this to Power BI. We can then take this to all sorts of different places. But the idea here is Assemble is meant to not only bridge the gap between design and construction, but to also give its users complete control over the information that is important to them. Whether it be cost, whether it be quantity, whether it be status and percentage complete, your BIM data has never been so customizable. It's never been so accessible. It's never been so collaborative. Everyone now has access to the same data set. 10 different people can get 10 different views of the same data set for their 10 different workflows. It really is enabling teams to work with BIM in a construction-centric and focused workflow, whether it be sorting, filtering, whatever it might be. Even if you don't use Assemble, please look into BIM in general. When we look at 2D workflows and conventional processes against BIM, the findings are conclusive that BIM is much more efficient. It's more eco-friendly. It's better for everyone. It's better for the environment. It's better for construction as a whole. We want productivity to go up from 1% a year. I could be 99% more productive if I have quantities out of the box for myself. So whether or not you're using a tool like ours, a tool from Autodesk, anything at all, my biggest thing is that look at BIM as a whole and look at how you can start to build out BIM execution plans to help designers design better for your process. If you're a designer, start thinking about what can I provide in a model that'll make it more useful for construction. We think construction is one of the most collaborative industries, but it's still fragmented, and everyone needs to come together in a way that's productive for the entire industry. And I think that BIM is the best way to connect all of these parts and pieces and really smooth out that fragmentation. The BIM 360 process, it is a pretty important thing to touch on. We can come in and very easily connect to BIM 360. Say we want to drive in and grab a document. You see that I'm able to come in and grab any of those documents. We want to link together objects. We can select an object out of BIM 360. We have access to project files. You notice now that I'm able to pull up those documents. I'm able to pull up other information. This wasn't a good example. Let's go back out to project files. You get general documentation. This is perfect. Maybe we want now a PowerPoint or a other piece of information, whatever it might be. From there, we want to create an issue. It's the same way. We can come in, create those issues on a particular object. And as you create that issue, it'll push directly back into BIM 360 and aggregate in the issue manager in BIM 360.